Good evening. Welcome to the January 8th, 2019 Council Committee meeting. My name is Matt Zimmerman, Council President and Council Member from Ward 1, and I will be chairing this meeting tonight. Besides myself, the committee members here tonight are Jim Neighbor from Ward 1, Eric Jenkins and Mike Kemling from Ward 2, Stephanie Meyer, Lisa and Larsa Bonnell from Ward 3, Mickey Sandifer and Lindsay Constance from Ward 4. Before we begin our agenda, I'd like to explain our procedure for public input. During the meeting, I will offer the opportunity for public input. If you'd like to speak to the committee at any of those times, please go to the podium. I will ask you to state your name and address for the record. Then you may offer your comments. So the members of the audience can hear your comments, I would ask that you speak directly into the microphone. And by policy, comments are limited to 5 minutes. After you are finished, please sign the form on the podium to ensure we have an accurate record of your name and address. We have 3 items on tonight's agenda. The first item is to discuss the Belmont Promenade Redevelopment District. Joe Serrano with Kutak Rock and Jim Pritchard with Columbia Capital will provide more information. Welcome, Joe.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Joe Serrano, Kutak Rock. We serve as city's bond counsel. With me is Jim Pritchard, Columbia Capital, who's the city's municipal advisor. Tonight, Jim and I are going to have a brief discussion about the Belmont Promenade project. It's been a year and a half or so since the approvals came before the governing body. I think it was in July of 2017. Some things have changed since that time, some market conditions and some theories, and a little bit of the ask from the developers is modified. So there's certain items, action items, that we may seek a little bit of direction or guidance. In addition, there's a few new council members since that 2017 approval. City staff thought it would be appropriate and helpful if we provided an update as to where we are, maybe talk through some of the topics, the major deal points for the issuance of the bonds, maybe possibly seek a little bit of direction or at least dialogue from the committee, answer any questions that you may have. This is really a project of this magnitude. Is what we were discussing. It's I don't want to say it's unique, but it's one that we want to provide more information than less. So having more touches and hearing about the project, I think would be beneficial for you to make informed decisions as we go forward. So if I may, is it just, let's see, okay. So for tonight, the agenda will be, we'll talk briefly about the project itself and the requested incentives. We talk about incentives. We may mention like a public investment, but we'll talk a little bit about why we're investing in this project, or why you may consider investing in this project, the budget project and the financing sources. And then there may be some topics for discussion related to the terms of the bonds that are being proposed by the developer. So as a brief overview, you may just refresh your memory. The project site is located at the southwest corner of Shawnee Mission Parkway and Maurer Road, and it comprises about 26 acres of 8 parcels of land. There are a couple components of this project. There's a mixed-use component that's been proposed. It's on the southern edge of the project site. That is now 249 units, market rate residential units. There's about a little over 10,000 square feet of retail space in that development, and the developer, Belmont, plans to sell that portion to a third-party developer. In addition, there's a retail that's fronting Shawnee Mission Parkway. It's about 159 square feet of retail. There's restaurants. There's 3,800 square feet of restaurants on the southeast corner. There's 31,200 square feet of what we've been calling a restaurant row. What has been represented, the developer anticipates that the project will be fully operational, open by the fall of 2020.
Sure. So this next slide is just a brief overview of the incentives that the developer is requesting. First, they are asking for a 20-year TIF. That would entail 90% of the property taxes captured and 100% of the city's 1% sales tax. They're also asking for a 22-year CID that have a 1.6% sales tax, and would also capture estimated $5.3 million in property taxes. With those two, the TIF and the CID, they're wanting combined $19.5 million in bond proceeds, which would be issued by the city as special obligation bonds. And then lastly, they're asking for a sales tax exemption that we are estimating the value to be somewhere between $3 and $3.5 million.
Let me interrupt real fast. For the special obligation bonds, while we see, and we represent several cities in Johnson County, what we see more often than not is PAYGO financing. We ended up negotiating this deal in 2017, and the developer required, or virtually said, the project won't go forward unless we issue special obligation bonds, special obligation revenue bonds, which would be backed by the TIF and the CID revenues. We see that in development in Johnson County more on a PAYGO basis, and we could talk a little bit about PAYGO financing a little bit. But the reason why I say the magnitude of this project is not only do you have this incentive request for TIF, CID special assessment, CID sales tax, you have your IRBs, but layer on top of that are special obligation bonds. And included in that, and importantly, and we've talked about this in the past, the city is not in any way backing the payment or the debt service on these bonds. This is solely going to be revenue generated, the tax revenues generated from TIF or CID that will be debt service in the bonds. And we'll talk a little bit about sizing those bonds briefly, but importantly, this is not a geo-backed, and you may be seeing some information in the paper, in some of these projects with appropriation-backed bonds. That is not what we're dealing with. This is the revenue itself is going to debt service those bonds.
Right. And I would say all of these incentives combined are pretty significant, I think, especially for the area. So here's the project budget that was provided to us. This was provided directly by the developer. We have no way to vet these numbers or validate any of these numbers, but the developer did represent to us that they hired a contractor to come up with these cost estimates. One thing I'll point out, you'll see towards the bottom, the developer fee, which is about $1.5 million. Anything to add to that?
No.
Okay. Here are the project funding sources or capital stack. The thing that we're most concerned about is the first line item there, $19.5 million that they're asking for through the issuance of special obligation bonds. The biggest item for about half of the total project cost is through land sales and third-party development. That's the apartment complex or the mixed use, mainly apartment complex plus a little bit of retail. So basically half of the project is being funded through a third party. And then the other two numbers, we estimated ourselves based on what we think their commercial lender would approve.
Real fast.
Yeah.
It should be noted on this one, I think when we came out last, the total project budget costs were a little over $90 million, maybe 92. I think it's now up to the total cost of 98, almost $99 million.
Do you want to cover this part?
Sure. So as we mentioned, these are special obligation revenue bonds. This slide is just or what's being proposed to be financing this project are these special obligation revenue bonds. Just to kind of backtrack just a little bit, we did negotiate a development agreement. The development agreement in 2017 had certain conditions that needed to be met in order for us to be able to issue the bonds. So this kind of highlights a little bit of some of those. It's not all-inclusive list of those conditions, but in short, Belmont has to acquire all the property within the TIF and the CID. we will have an independent revenue provider. We've actually been working with GAI for this revenue study, and that's going to be a study that's independent of the feasibility study that you may be seeing in the next couple weeks associated with a statutory finding, but rather it's a bond revenue study. And you'll be receiving, we will be receiving that and scrutinizing that. In addition, there's going to be some documentations that the underwriter will be required. There will be a guaranteed maximum price contract. Among those, we'll have to look at and review those leases that will be executed for the tenants that will be going into the spaces. There will be a performance and payment bond and a completion guarantee. So there's going to be a due diligence aspect that's associated with the bond financing. We'll try to at least cover risk to the city as best we possibly can. The underwriters also has an obligation to market these bonds, and they're going to make certain that they're marketable to the bond investors. They don't want to go out and have, start with a potential default. So they'll have some requirements themselves, and so that documentation of the due diligence is important for what the underwriter will be, as well as for the city and even the developers, lenders. Again, the condition in the current development agreement is that we're only going to sell to accredited investors with $100,000 denominations. That's going to continue. There was this concept that kind of stalled us a little bit, which was this element of, can we issue bonds on spaces that are not under a lease, untenanted space? And we originally, as bond counsel, said, no, we don't want to do that. But working with the developer, we were able to overcome, kind of that concept. There had been a couple other permutations from that concept, but in short, we are now in a position to say, yeah, we could issue bonds on the project. There could be some spaces that are not tenanted, and to the extent that that space is not tenanted, we would escrow bond proceeds. And we'll talk a little bit about a release from that escrow fund in order to either pay off bonds or to reimburse project costs if they're eligible project costs under a period of time that is kind of endorsed by the bond market. And in addition, there'll be some legal and tax opinions. So currently what we have is this is in our development agreement short. I mean, there are other things, the rights and duties and obligations of the parties, but these are the conditions that are important for us for issuing bonds. The developer said, hey, we can't really get this project financed under some of these conditions, not all of them, but some of these conditions, and we're going to have to rework our development agreement. So in your packet tonight, there are some major deal points for the bond issuance. Some of those in the next few slides, we'll talk about those major deal points. And again, we may want some dialogue. So I should have said up front, if you have any questions, please stop us and we'll answer those questions as best we possibly can. But we may want to seek, some of the information may be informational, like, hey, it's changed. You want to make certain you understand the change. And some of it is, hey, this may be a policy, or at least delegate it to city staff and its consultants to maybe negotiate with the developer to figure out, and with underwriter input to see what is palatable to the market that protects the city as best we possibly can.
Sure. So, as we think about renegotiating the redevelopment agreement, we've put together a list of policy considerations. So one of the major points that Belmont is representing to us is that to continue with the project, they need the pre-construction special obligation bonds sold first. So the question to the city is, are you comfortable proceeding with pre-construction special obligation bonds? Certainly risk with that. When you do pre-construction, when you sell pre-construction bonds, you're basically requiring the investor to take construction risk, which is going to increase your cost of capital. Also, the construction costs are somewhat unknown, so they could change, they could be higher, so you have that risk as well. We can work things into the agreements to help mitigate those risks, like having a guaranteed maximum price agreement and performance bonds. to ensure the project moves us forward. But certainly a lot of things to consider when you're basically issuing bonds without any type of development first taking place. And did we want to talk a little bit about risk as well? Some of the other risks. So, when Joe was speaking earlier, the risk to the city isn't necessarily directly to your pocketbook, because though these are special obligation bonds, they're not backed by your general obligation credit or an appropriation pledge, but the city's name is on the deal, and so you have a reputation risk. And also, on future economic bond deals, you could have the risk of having an increased interest cost, because investors will look back at those prior projects that might have defaulted. So being mindful of default risk is, I think, is something very important. And related to that, another somewhat new phenomenon that's going on is the dark store theory. That's been something that's been gaining momentum, and it's not a specific risk to this deal. It's a broad risk to all deals like this. And at this point, we're not sure how to mitigate that risk. But it's something, we really need to consider. Do you have anything to add to that?
And I don't know how much we want to talk about the dark store theory, but this is a new valuation of property tax, the methodology of valuing property. And when we have TIF bonds and they're backed by the incremental tax, their debt service by that increment that is generated, and a developer comes in and protests their taxes below even the base, how is that going to impact the debt service on the bonds? And it's relatively new. Honestly, we've heard about it, and you always talk about the right to protest your property taxes. But these big boxes have said, hey, listen, we're not, and I don't want to get into too much of the detail of that because I don't know it all that well. But short, there's a theory that's going that can actually drive down the property tax value, and it's spreading throughout. I mean, there's deals up in I think Pennsylvania. There are several. I think there's one. There's actually, if you've heard about it, there's several in Johnson County. The Board of Tax Appeals has taken well, they'll be looking at this. The county itself is, as you probably have heard, there's a lot at stake, and we've tried to figure out how do we mitigate that. Well, the first thing is we have to disclose it in the bond documents. This is a new theory. It's undecided, and it's going to be extremely important as to how we price and how do we disclose. So, it's a different approach. One of the things that I talked about at the beginning is things have changed. That's a significant one. I think that's one that has changed in the last couple of years that we're still trying to figure out. We'll be working with the underwriter to figure out how to best disclose a potential theory that can impact the debt service on the bonds. The retail market, we talk about the retail market. Maybe you want to visit a little bit about the retail market, and there are other variables, the construction cycle, what if there's a delay? All that could come into, does it increase the gap? How does it impact our financing? But there are things that we are working through with the developer with you, but it's important to highlight that there are some things that have changed. And we'll try to mitigate that risk to the city as best we possibly can.
Yeah, I will say there was a New York Times article on the dark store theory just a few days ago, so that might be a good article to look up.
Yeah. Any questions? We're not asking. Yes, please.
In this case, unlike the Zona Rosa thing that you might have heard of, that you would not see a rating downgrade from that, because unlike here, they had an appropriation backing and they chose not to appropriate. Here, there'd be no appropriation backing, so you wouldn't see a rating downgrade. So purely reputational. The risk you would have financially is on future economic deals like this, investors might charge a premium on your bonds, so.
But not on the GEO bonds.
Not on the GEO bonds, no.
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in and just, from a council level, we have not issued special obligation bonds before, so just making sure we have kind of a clear understanding on the difference between general obligation and special obligation bonds. And then just from things that they've discussed, just a clear understanding that at some point, maybe within the developer's control and something like dark store theory, something outside the developer's control, these bonds could go into default at some point. So just want to make sure that that you guys have an understanding of some of those factors that could weigh in, that could make this development successful, and some things that really kind of outside the city's control, outside the developer's control, that could impact this development. So just want to make sure that if there's any questions or issues there, that we kind of talk about kind of the risk, the reputational risk, what's a financial risk, what's not a financial risk, make sure we have kind of the true pros and cons of kind of going down this path. So.
Right. Mr. Neighbor.
Yeah, I guess my question was talking about the risk and default and all this. Anybody doing a deal of this size faces the same problems, is that correct? These are not unique to this deal.
Fundamentally, it's not unique to this deal. The difference is in Johnson County that the cities that we represent generally are doing PAYGO financing. We've kind of overcome that PAYGO and we're now into bonds. And that's what has been negotiated in the development agreement as of now. But the risks themselves are but for these variables that are relatively new and how that may process, it's not that much different. The difference is if you PAYGO finance, that risk shifts to the developer, not to the bond owners. If there's a default, it's for possibly subsequent development deals that may have an uptick in the interest rate. Right. Yeah, they'll set that rate on the time that we issue those bonds.
Any other questions, comments?
Okay.
Lindsay?
I know we've talked about it before, but can you review why we're not doing PAYGO as in other Johnson County developments?
Well, okay. This is a little bit of a history, so I apologize. So when this is a difficult piece of property to develop. I think there have been at least 3, maybe this is maybe the 4th developer that's come. There are some construction, some just additional costs, whether it's the train or what have you. So we've tried to pitch it and we've tried to market it and we've tried to get a developer that would actually do it on a PAYGO finance basis, but we were unable to achieve that. In fact, our original development agreement in 2017 had PAYGO financing, and at the discretion of the city, we would issue bonds. So it could be in that language of in that development, we could have actually issued bond after you get some history on revenue projection. Now we're using sole assumptions and projections. If we actually developed the site, had some actual revenue numbers, we could have taken out that construction debt taken out PAYGO financing at a later time. But the negotiations went and the developer requested, and quite honestly, the project wouldn't have gone forward is what we understand unless there were special obligation bonds. I think it was represented in their model. And so we actually yanked out the PAYGO financing in that development agreement, and now it's special obligation bonds. Not to say that we can't talk about that, but right now under the development agreement, but even though they can't go forward under the conditions precedent, it is special obligation bond financing.
Any other comments? So just from my own behalf, I want to reiterate, this is the financing package. If we don't go this way, the development's just not going to happen.
As far as it's been represented to the city and the consultants that with this developer, it is being required to have special obligation bonds issued on the pre-construction project.
Correct. And to confirm, there's no financial risk to the city. It is a reputational risk, not on a bond rating scale, but on just a reputation.
I think that's a fair statement.
All right.
If you did, as we talk about in other cities, if you do this routinely and you see defaults, it starts questioning who actually is making those decisions, who's sitting at where you are sitting.
Right.
But this is new to the city. It's extremely important. It's a big project. And I think it was important for us to we can work through these. But the crux of it is, no, the city is not on the hook to debt service these bonds in no way. It's solely from the revenue.
All right. So, Joe, so that we're on the same page, would you like input from us at this point to proceed? How would you like this to?
As we go through the questions, I think comments on each one.
Okay.
And Mr. Chairman, this is one, this question is kind of the precursor. We may want to table this until the very end and we run through some of the other
Right.
variables that if we may. And some of them
Absolutely.
is, but this is kind of it's kind of recited at the very end. Are you still comfortable with special obligation bonds?
All right.
The next policy consideration, again, this is kind of tailoring off the term sheet that was presented by the developer to the city and some of the negotiations that have been going on. We've represented to you that we will, there could be a gap in financing. They are asking for $19.5 million of bond proceeds. That we may not be able to size these bonds, and there could be a gap in financing. And all along, while we've right now have 3 series of bonds, they came back to us recently and want a 4th series of bonds. It's a junior series, it's a subordinate series of bonds. But it was new, and we've always talked about financing the gap on a pay-go basis. In fact, that started right after the approval of the development agreement. Said, hey, listen, if there's a gap, we don't have pay-go in our provisions. We need to include that. Well, they came back to us, and again, this is somewhat of informational, or at least to clarify. We talked about pay-go. Right now, it's being proposed that there's a 4 series of bonds whereby it's a junior series of bonds, and that bond will be placed either with the developer or with the developer's lender. We don't see much of a problem on that. In pay-go financing, we see a collateral assignment. You wouldn't even see a junior series of bonds. You just collaterally assign it, and then lenders are comfortable. But the developer's lender apparently, and we haven't visited with the developer's lender, we will, but apparently this is a request from the developer's lender, this 4 series of bonds, which is different than what we've talked about in the past. Again, junior to all the other bonds that will be issued, and it will be developer held or developer lenders held. So that's an informational more for consideration. The next one is also more of informational. In a few slides, and maybe I could have brought the escrow slide. We could have brought the escrow slide up a little bit further, but we have in the development agreement that we want to have bonds issued within 4 years of the date of that approval of the development agreement. Part of that was we didn't want to have a small sliver, $500,000 of bonds, $200,000 of bonds issued when they're eligible costs. And they could be going out forever until the TIF runs dry. So we put a date, and it's not unusual to put a date in there. That, hey, listen, get all the bonds. It's kind of leverage to keep the project going. Your last bond issue would be at a date certain. We work through this escrow concern with the developer. We're not as concerned with that time for which additional bonds can be issued. But it does change the development agreement. We wanted to highlight that. In addition, if additional bonds are ever issued, has to be some blend of what the current bond owner's viewpoint would be. There would be this called additional bonds test, as well as there would be some, and it would be pretty stringent to be able to issue those additional bonds. But importantly, as Jim and I were talking today, is that, if you can overcome the additional bonds test, then it's really that the project is doing pretty well. And there are eligible costs that would be able to debt service those additional bonds. So we don't fundamentally have a problem with this particular removal of the restriction on time. But if you have a problem, we would like to know so that we would address that in the development agreement.
Yeah, I'd just say, as you're renegotiating this might be an easy point to give to them, because I think we're pretty agnostic about it.
All right. Any questions on this issue? Okay, thank you.
Okay, this is one we would hopefully like to seek a little bit of a discussion or maybe some guidance. The term sheet provided, this is really associated with the project fund. This issue came to light I don't know, when we were talking about how what we call the capital stack is going to flow through to this project. What they do not, so real quickly, you issue bonds, the proceeds of the bonds come in and they go and fund these various funds, one of which is the escrow that we talked a little bit about. And one is a project fund. We'll have a debt service fund. So the flow of funds will come down into various pockets. One of them is this project fund. And real quickly, to contrast PAYGO financing is if we just we didn't issue bonds, when the revenues came in each year, assuming that they are eligible expenses that were certified, then that revenue would go and be diverted to reimburse the developer for the cost. Well, in a bond financed project, the money's sitting in this project fund. And as long as they're eligible costs, can we then pay out those costs? One of the big costs initially is the reimbursement of land acquisition. It's their land acquisition costs. Right now, I think that the amount that they want to, it's a $6 million roughly purchase price, and they want $4.5 million reimbursed virtually on the date soon after we close. We've talked about this simultaneous closing with respect to they don't own the property. The developer doesn't own the property, but they want to take down that property, own the property, and then get reimbursed almost immediately for that $4.5 million of the $6 million. Some cities that we represent, and it doesn't have to be the policy of the city because it's not the policy of every city, but some cities that we represent say, hey, listen, we may not want to have more invested in this development than the developer at any given time. Well, if we do this, we'd have to look at those eligible costs that the developer would be submitting. Let's say they have $2 million of engineering costs and site costs, site improvement costs. Well, they wouldn't have that because they don't have the property. But let's say they have pre-development costs that are reimbursable. So the question then becomes, does the city feel comfortable in reimbursing, let's say in this example, $4.5 million for land acquisition? You may have more of an investment in the development than the developer. How we counteract that is, hey, listen, we have a guaranteed maximum price contract, we have performance bonds, we have a completion guarantee, so we're trying to mitigate the risk. But there could be a fundamental philosophy of a city that says, hey, listen, we're willing to invest in this project. We don't want to have more investment than you do. And so this question is really intended to say, do you think the direction should be? Because the request says, we don't want any restrictions on those project funds. If there's eligible costs that come in, we want to get that reimbursed right away. And the question to the committee is that palatable for you?
So let me make sure I understand all of that.
Sure.
So first off, you're talking about a performance and payment bond, so that gives us some protection no matter what, right?
Yeah, there's going to be a maximum price contract. You can't exceed that amount. There'll be performance and there'll be a completion guarantee that's going to be required by the underwriter.
All right. And performance bonding is all based on the GMP, so
Right.
this feels pretty safe to me from
Yeah, I mean,
years of construction.
the concern is will they develop it as they promised? And as long as we have these other benchmarks in place, I shouldn't say as long, but one to counteract, to assist in mitigating risk if the developer doesn't develop as promised, are these guarantees and the completion guarantee, the performance payment bonds.
All right. But the city doesn't have any money invested in this.
The city doesn't have any money invested, but it's a public incentive. It's the public incentive that actually is going to go to reimburse. The bonds themselves are going to reimburse those costs. And so so we have $99 million, of which public money is 19.5. Of that public money, $4.5 million is going into the development soon after the bond issuance.
Gotcha. Which is protected by performance payment bonds.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right.
And other protections.
Right.
And there may be other criteria. I mean, this may be dictated by the underwriter also. I mean, there may be some underwriter criteria that we're going to be addressing, but we wanted to vet this to the committee to see if there was any particular concern that we needed to write into the development agreement.
Right. So the underwriters themselves may be layering on additional protection.
Yeah, but what we've heard from the underwriter thus far is they're okay with making those reimbursed. They're
comfortable with all that.
They are. and we've hired them as our consultant. It's just, or are we going to rely on them solely to determine the marketability and the risk to those bond owners?
Right. You have questions, comments?
We have not issued special obligation bonds.
What are other cities, what have they done?
Well,
You're comparing.
sometimes they'll look at, and we'll talk a little bit about the debt service ratio. Say, for instance, the underwriter will require $1.25 so that $1.25 coverage. That means for every debt service, for $1 for every debt service, you need $1.25 of revenue. Some cities are now moving that up. To instead of, if the underwriter is only requiring $1.25 or $1.30, they may go up to $1.40. So there's some kind of manipulation in some of the requirements. Some cities just won't issue special obligation bonds, and other cities are requiring at least as much of a equity component investment that the developer would have than the public incentive would be.
Lindsay?
So if we said, no, we're not comfortable, we don't want that to happen, then what?
We have not had that discussion with the developer. We have received a term sheet, the term sheet that is in your packet, and I think it provides, if I have it, it just says there will be no restrictions. So it seems to indicate that the project may not go forward, although we've not had that discussion in detail with the developer. At least, is that a fair statement?
So we don't know if that's a deal killer.
We don't know if it's a deal killer. Yeah. It has been offered to us to discuss with the developer's lender some of the terms, and we just have not been able to coordinate that. So, this may be a lender concern. It may be associated with, hey, listen, if we receive that $4.5 million on the date that we close, you reinvest that could be an equity component of the private loan. But we don't know that. We have not been able to have that conversation with the developer's lender.
All right. So, go ahead, Lisa.
So is the possibility that the city would be investing more upfront and have more of an investment in the project than the developer, is that something that's disclosed in the bond issuance?
No.
That's a possibility.
That's not. That's just kind of how the flow of funds actually work. This is really a policy of the city, not really it could come to a bond owner concern, but right now I don't think it rises to the level of bond owner concern unless you see otherwise.
No.
But a sophisticated bond buyer would potentially understand that that is a risk to the project.
Well, that's why we have accredited investors.
Existential risk at best for the city, but maybe it's more of a concern for the actual owners of these bonds.
Absolutely. They're the ones that are putting their money on the line. That's correct.
And thank you for bringing that up. This is not so much a risk to the city outside of the reputation piece that we've talked about. It's the people making the investment in the bonds.
Absolutely.
And they themselves would want to protect this with performance and payment bonds and all, et cetera, et cetera.
That's correct.
Okay.
So just real quick, is there any concern about having an unrestricted project fund in our development agreement as what the developer is asking? So anytime there's eligible reimbursement costs within reason, meaning we have to worry about city staff processing or the consultants processing these reimbursement requests, that means we have to look to see, okay, are these eligible expenses? What is the amount? We have to vet those. Somebody has to scrutinize those to make certain that we're not doing anything inappropriate. Am I going to the Bahamas and charging that as an expense? So somebody's going to have to go through those. And, we could put in there, hey, listen, we could do it. I think they want it on a monthly basis. We may, if you have no problem with unrestricted disbursements from the project fund without any restriction, maybe we put it on a time. It absolutely will have to be monitored, but we are still working through what there will be a monitoring process, meaning we cannot make disbursements out of the project fund. It will not be allowed. But the monitoring itself, if they want to do it on a monthly basis, which is what they're proposing, probably because of the lender's concern, they want to get paid back from the construction costs. But it's going to take some time. I mean, it's a time-consuming process that is thrown over to the city. It's an administrative burden to the city.
Who pays for that?
Well, we have an administration cost that is associated with, in the development
The
agreement.
city will be reimbursed for the time that it puts into it.
Yes, or we are working to figure out if we may have to hire an outside party to scrutinize and audit those statements.
But not at an expense of the city.
It would be reimbursed costs from the revenues, right?
Thank
All
you.
right, so I'm going to try and sum that up. We've got a check and a balance from a third party. It's going to run checks and balances on the cash flow. We've got performance and payment bonds to protect the investors and the city's reputation. And we are going in uncharted territory, but we've got some belts and suspenders in place. Is that what I'm hearing here?
Yes, yes, Mr. Chairman, that is correct. You know, and I always liken this to star bonds because star bonds actually, it's similar to what TIF is, it's sales tax, but it's similar to what you're doing. And in Star Bond Act, you actually have to issue bonds. You can't pay-go finance it. So some of those comments that you actually have, it's uncharted territory in this type of arena where it's TIF, CID, and a special assessment. That is uncharted, and it's a broad request. But issuance of just revenue bonds is in and of itself is not uncharted.
Right. So nobody got to second base by keeping their foot on first.
No comment.
Okay.
Any feedback, comment, anything that we need to
Comments,
address?
thoughts?
Okay, all right. Jim's going to take the next one.
Yeah, so, when we were looking at the sources of funds, the biggest number there was about $50 million. And that's going towards the apartment or the mixed-use development. So that's half the project. And, you know, Belmont, at the beginning of this project, will sell that to that third-party developer. And so half the project is sort of out of their control. So the question is, should the city have a separate development agreement with that mixed-use developer? And I'm not sure if that developer has been named yet. But certainly in our opinion, we think that you should, and have those same types of performance protections that you have with Belmont. Anything to add to that? Yeah, so, you know, that wasn't addressed in the original agreement, so we think we should move forward with a separate development agreement.
Yeah, that separate development wasn't in the original agreement either, so there's a good reason why it was in there.
Yeah.
And I would certainly concur that we should have an agreement with the developer, the mixed-use developer. I really think we should.
I think there's some open items that we are not, that we will have to work through. How much revenue is directed to that third-party developer? But clearly, as we proceed forward, this developer needs to be, you know, subscribe to the obligations on the development agreement. And whether it's this development agreement is another part added to this development agreement or a separate development agreement that's for that project. But it is something that we had not explored in our previous development agreement.
Lisa?
May I ask a quick question? I'm sorry, I'm a little bit confused. Is this mixed-use component developer not Bach Homes? What is their relationship to this project?
Yeah, that's Bach Homes. I mean, we
okay,
just didn't
so
know
that
if it's
had
been
been
vetted or not
previously
to the.
Public, that
Yeah,
was,
yeah.
I didn't just let the cat out of the bag. I didn't.
I don't think so.
swear I
I
didn't.
don't think so. We just didn't want to let the cat out of the bag. Oh. You want me to take this one?
Which one is?
Yeah, so we're almost done. And I'm sorry it's taken a little bit of time, but I appreciate your patience. So this next policy question is a consideration is, this is what I was talking about escrowing, that we had this untenanted space, that we were not going to issue bonds on that untenanted space. Now we're going to issue bonds once either at a date certain, let's say 3 years from the date of issuance, either those bonds go to reimburse the developer if they lease that space, or they go back and redeem bonds. They'll pay down some bonds. It's structured that way. It's relatively, I don't want to say normal, but it's endorsed. It's not a flaw in how you structure bonds. What is a little bit different is how do you release those funds from that escrow? How do you release those monies from the escrow fund? They want it upon, the developer wants it, the release is conditioned upon signed leases and executed purchase sale agreements. That I think may be a little bit of an unusual request. I think sometimes we see what we've typically seen in situations where, whether it's a PAYGO financing or some kind of reimbursement, it's a covenant to open, or they're open and stocked for business. And there's vetting of the term of the lease itself. This item, their request is to have signed leases and executed purchase agreements. I don't know if that's what the city would want to weigh in. Do we want to delegate this kind of to the underwriter? What the underwriter could necessarily market? Because that fund, they're either going to pay the bonds, redeem bonds, or they're going to pay the developer. And so some of these things are shifted over to the underwriter. But I do have to say, from my experience, having signed leases and executed purchase sale agreements is a little bit different than having a tenant in the building with fully stocked for and opened. So that's the request. Again, if you want to have any feedback that you would want the city and their consultants to negotiate with the developer, we'd happy to take that. Please. Oh.
The underwriters are still going to dictate and control the situation anyway.
In a lot of respects, we can go broader than them. We could have more restrictions than what the underwriter will require.
Okay.
And in the spirit of Mickey's comment, it's the underwriter that's bearing the risk on this. It is not the city.
Absolutely. The underwriter has their investor pool, and they'll be looking at their investor pool to see, are they selling this in good faith?
Right.
It seems though that it would be reasonable to have some kind of conditions upon that signed leases and so on. What if he signs a lease, say, I'm going to move in 18 months or something like that? You know, maybe there should be at least a time frame, within this time frame at least, the lease will be executed within 90 days.
Some structure around that, yeah.
Because just leave wide open like that, who knows, you know? So they may think they have a lead on a potential lessee, and it may be quite a while before they have to sell their other place, they got to do all kinds of stuff, eventually they're going to move in. In the meantime, it's just hanging out there, so. I don't know, I think it might be reasonable to put some kind of, if we're going to do this, to at least put some kind of time restrictions on it.
Okay.
Is that something you can negotiate going forward without setting this back?
Yeah, I think we would have a good conversation associated with the developer that, again, we want input so that when we go back, because you will in the next couple of months be receiving a document that covers some of these items. And if you give us that direction to negotiate, that we will do our best, and we'll report back to you when we present the development agreement.
Right. I would agree with Mr. Jenkins on that comment.
We will take that and make note of that. If I may finish up, and we kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. And again, some of this stuff is just what is financeable and what is the market going to bear. And this is kind of in that same vein. It says certain items and conditions for marketing and issuing bonds are delegated to the underwriter. That's why we hired we went through a process to hire this underwriter, such as a square foot that's going to be required before we issue bonds, and what is required to be leased. This is what we talked a little bit about, that debt service ratio. Do we want to have anything more that you see? And again, it's new. It's new to the city, so that means it's new to you as to what we're doing. do you want to have any more stringent requirements, or do we want to rely, but for the issue that we just talked about on the timeframe for the signed leases, do we want to have anything more than what the underwriter is requiring? Or do we want to rely on what the underwriter's telling us is necessary for the issuance of the bonds?
Sanford?
Any more requirements that we put on this is just going to jeopardize the project more, is that correct? And whether or not we could even get the project in our city.
I don't know that. Our purpose is to make certain that we give you as much education to make these decisions, and some of these things may, we don't know if it's going to jeopardize the project or not.
But it's been indicated that it could.
What we have is a term sheet that says this is what we need in order to issue bonds, so I would suspect that would be, in fact, a fair statement.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Again, this is the last question, is does the city desire to require the tenant to be open prior to the release of the escrow bond proceeds? We've already we just talked about that, that question. So we get back to the initial question, and first of all, are there any questions that we can address? Because this is it's a big ask, it's a big project. Is there anything that we could address now that we haven't been able to address thus far?
So I want to make sure I understand one thing. One of the very first slides that popped up here was a little spreadsheet of the estimated costs of the project. I think 19.5 million was, which slide? I believe that was it, yeah. Do I understand it right? That's a contractor's estimate? Where did that number come? Because,
The first two
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The first two numbers, I believe, are from Belmont, and then the last two numbers, they wouldn't provide, so we tried to estimate to get to the total. We had the total number
Gotcha.
of the 98 point.
But in terms of the portion of this project that's going to qualify for TIFs and CIDs,
Oh, right.
there's some very, very strict rules and regulations about what qualifies for that. I want to make sure that when everything is said and done, that we've got this buttoned up legally and we don't have our tails hanging out on.
You want to go through this? Okay, so that $19.5 million is a negotiated number. It's like our cap. It's our cap, but we negotiated in 2017, the $19.5 million. A part of it is how you're sizing, what are we projecting those revenues to be? As you may recall, and I apologize for belaboring this a little bit even longer, but you may recall that we actually went back and redid the district plan, which brought in that 8 mills to the school district. All along, that $19.5 million has remained flat. It was a negotiated number that says this is what we need in order for the project to go forward. So that $19.5 million was what kind of collectively we've kind of approved, if you will. And then the $50 million, I think, is what has been vetted through the municipal advisor and the developer.
Okay. All right.
Other questions? Anything? We want to make certain you have as much information as possible.
You got us on information overload right now.
Well, we get back to the question, are you comfortable in proceeding? And again, you don't have to answer that question, but if you're comfortable in proceeding with special obligation revenue bonds backed by this type of revenue, we will continue to work with the developer to negotiate a development agreement. There's a lot of steps that will be required from now until the time that we issue bonds. You may see us once or twice more before we get to that stage, but hopefully that we will be able, with your permission, to negotiate as necessary to protect the city's interests as best we possibly can.
Sure. So Joe, I think what we're really after here is a yay or a nay on proceeding with the structure as discussed tonight. If we've got some special concerns, let's get those out. We spoke to one of them already, the requirements for the how we structure the verbiage for the lease. I think I'll ask the council for a quick vote on just proceeding with, as it's planned, with special obligation bonds versus PAYGO. I'll take a motion to proceed in that fashion, and then we'll follow up with some discussion about a couple other items.
Move to proceed?
Second?
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed?
Nay.
All right. There's one answer for you.
That's great. That's
Yeah.
helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so now I think one of the next pieces here that you wanted us to discuss, specifically related to, let me catch up with you here. Oh, I'm sorry, it was the separate development agreement with the mixed-use developer. That was the other piece in all this, right?
Right.
So what do you need from us tonight specifically to keep that on the rails and keep the negotiations going?
I think with that motion to proceed, we have not had a lot of discussions associated with this component of the project. We will need to talk with the third-party developer, Bach Homes. We'll need to talk with the developer. We've not had that, and part of that is, hey, listen, this is a little bit different than what
Right.
you've seen. So I think with that motion to proceed, it'll give us the authority to deal with Bach Homes and Belmont and their council associated with that.
Right.
But it's important that we get that locked down sooner rather than later.
Right.
And will we have that information by next Monday?
The
Whether the Bach Homes and whether
I have not.
hearing?
We'll just have to.
We'll
work
have to
with
find
them
out.
and see kind of timeline. It'll take us some time to negotiate that.
Okay.
Yeah, the negotiations of development agreements, as you can imagine, can go in a whole different directions. And fundamentally, it is, we want them to at least subscribe to the obligations that are currently in the development agreement, those obligations to build. And now, how those flow of funds are diverted from Belmont to Bach Homes, we haven't had those discussions. So I don't know if we could get in a situation to have that kind of information before Monday night.
All right. But you have enough to get to second base.
We do.
Okay.
That's
all right.
correct.
All right. Any other comments from, Jim?
Just one question that, so even with all these negotiation things, with the April date that was posted in the packet, is that still valid?
Well, do you want me to answer this? I think there could be some other maneuvers. I understand that there's been a protest petition that has been filed. I don't know what may happen for planning. There could be some subsequent delays. We're trying to keep on moving forward. I think both the developer and the city, we've been in that path of start, stop. So we're now pushing forward. I think they have a strong objective to get this out of the ground. But that hard date is going to be difficult because there are so many intervening factors that could come into play. But we have to try to put something to meet that deadline or put a deadline so that we're working towards it.
More or less to clarify, we've got our job to do, you've got yours. I just wonder, the other development agreement, as far as the developer, is that going to present a time problem? And that was the scope of my question, and you probably answered it as well as it can be answered at this point.
We'll try. We're working on it, and I have not had any communication with that developers council. So I don't even know where that would rest, but we'll just keep on moving forward in that direction. And if there's a delay, you'll be the first to know. We will have some action items, I believe, next Monday associated with calling a public hearing on the TIF project plan and some maybe some other items, but. So we'll just keep on moving in that direction unless and until you tell us to stop.
All right. Good. Any other questions or comments for
I don't know
council?
if we resolved that or not. I was just kind of curious about that. I mean, I do want that a separate agreement with the tertiary developer.
Right. And I think that's conversations that need to take place now that we're headed for
Yeah,
second
I mean, we
base.
kind of beat around it, but I just want to make sure we got a concurrence on that as a committee that we want
And
to see
that's,
that.
yeah.
I don't think we can get finance. Actually, I mean, we have not talked with the underwriter associated with this. You may recall, Councilmember Jenkins, that we talked a little bit about that big escrow at one point in time for the mixed-use component. Well, we're trying to move around that, for bond financing. And so I don't think we could actually get adequate financing from underwriter to, but again, relatively new to us in terms of that portion of the project. So we'll work to try to we will have that resolved one way or the other. And we'll do it as quick as, in as diligent a timeframe as appropriate.
Would you like to speak?
I may help you on Monday night. And I've talked to Mr. Lysott about this, and I know some of the council members know about it. Greg Musil, 5250 West 116th Place, Suite 400, Leawood, Kansas, on behalf of the developer. Be happy to answer any other question about all these points. But for Monday night, we learned late this afternoon, Mr. Lysott and his Bell Road neighbors, Mr. Godsey and others had provided a revision plan that would move the western leg of the apartments to the center of the apartments, and Bach Homes has agreed to that. So our plan Monday night would be to ask to remand that to the Planning Commission to consider that, bring it back at the same time we hold the public hearing, hopefully, if you set it, on February 25th. And so I think that will resolve the zoning issue. We still have the incentive issues, and I'd be happy to speak to any of the questions you have on those. But for Monday night, I think we're going to be down to remanding to the Planning Commission and your consideration of setting a public hearing for February 25th. So that might ease your mind a little bit about Monday night.
And I understand that with these final revisions, that we're going to remove all obstacles and concerns from Mr. Lysott and the people in that area.
I don't think Don's ready to say that yet, but I think we're very close. And he wants to see it in a written form as opposed to, I told him tonight because I learned about an hour before this meeting. So I'm going to work with the development team and get him something tomorrow.
Okay, so in written form.
In written form.
We'll be good
Correct.
in written form.
And we'll get that to Mr. Allman and your planning staff as well, so, and Nolan, so that they're ready to go. But I think we're on a path forward. And it's been a little bit of a rocky path, but I think we may be getting to the crest of the hill.
Okay, thank you.
Anything further?
Any other questions for Mr. Serrano? You have any more questions for us?
No, thank you. Thank you
Okay, I
very
think
much for your
we're-
time. We
yeah,
didn't mean to go
yeah.
this long.
Yeah, thank you so much. No more questions from council. Any other questions from the public specific to the financing of the project only? State your name and your address, please.
Name's Alan Godsey. Address is 6800 Bell Road, Shawnee, Kansas. Good evening, council members. Appreciate the time tonight. I guess in light of sort of last comment by Mr. Musil, I'm going to modify what I had to say just a bit. But one of the concerns that we have with the project plan as it's being presented is this idea that they want to do a PUD-MUX rezoning, and they're basically going against the commercial requirements in the zoning regulations, where they're not providing enough commercial within that space. So my concern is that the city needs to make sure that the commercial part is built first before the apartments, so we don't wind up with just a bunch of apartments and then no commercial aspect to this. So I think it's almost kind of backwards of one of the things that was recommended. I think this thing could flip, you know, because they seem like they're not connected together. Like there's two different developers here and this has not been resolved. So that's a major concern. I haven't heard anybody discuss that. Sounds like a lot of risk, I guess, in general, but that was the primary comment that I had to make. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Godsey. Mickey?
Mr. Godsey, what we've been told was they're running on a deadline, and they have a very short period of time to get everything up and done in order to get these retail in there. I would think that the retail is probably, you're going to see it opening at the same or earlier than the apartments, my opinion, but I think they're going to be probably right in line of each other because of the deadlines that are set. They're running a real fine line in order to make sure they keep these guys. So that's what we're watching anyway with them. That's part of their goal of what they have to do to make this happen.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I'm with you on it. I agree.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Gotzi.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, concerns specific to the financing?
Good evening. Don Lysett, 6850 Bell Road. And just for the record, I do want it to be noted, while Mr. Musil commented, he had spoken with me, which he did. I am here on behalf of, insofar as that comment is concerned, on behalf of the Bell Neighborhood Group, as we've been calling ourselves. I'm going to address my questions here as a citizen and individually, insofar as I have some concerns about some of these things. That being said, I think the discussion has been helpful. It has clarified it. But please bear with me for a minute because I was trying to make notes, cross off questions as questions were answered and that type of thing. But I think one of the things I still keep coming back to is who with the city is verifying the numbers that we're basing everything on. What I hear, and if I'm mistaken, please correct me, is that these numbers are from the developer, but we have nothing in the background saying this is reasonable, this is not reasonable. Has the city retained anyone to go in and say, for example, the $50 million that they're saying the developer of the apartment's going to have in the game? Is that true? Is that remotely right? Because all of those numbers make a big difference on where the funding of this thing goes. I'm still not clear on, and maybe Mr. Serrano can help me here. What I'm hearing is sort of they're asking for a bridge loan, if you will, additional junior bonds to make up a gap in the event the bonds don't sell. Just to put numbers there, let's say 18 million sell, we got 19.5. I think they're asking the city to come in and pay the 1.5 out of the existing bonds. Am I correct, mistaken there? Okay. Mr. Toronto's shaking his head no.
Those bonds would be another series of bonds by which the developer or the developer's lender would buy that bond. The city's not buying that $1.5 million in that example.
Okay, so, all right, thank you.
Sure.
Just to clarify, we're making every effort to isolate all risk from the city on this.
And as well you should.
Yeah.
As well you should.
Right. Thank you.
I'm not understanding, there's a comment in the notes that Belmont was balking at a requirement that the bonds issued by essentially 4 years down the road, 7/10/21. I'm not sure why, if the plan is to build this thing out in 20. And again, I just think, I'm just drawing that to your attention because why is that an issue? I'm not clear on what the council's position is as to the suggestion or the inquiry by staff that the city have no more in the game than Belmont at any particular time. That was talked about, but I don't know as that was specifically addressed. I bring that to your attention. One of the other questions was, should the city require the mixed use to be built prior to the issuance? If it's going to be built, we would certainly think so, and we would suggest that be done. And as sort of part and parcel of that is Bach Home needs to be on board with this. I don't see how you can go forward without them being involved in this, and I understand sort of how the dominoes have to fall to some extent. I'm not privy to it all, obviously. But there should be agreements with them and their involvement in this in this project. I mean, they are the major player if you start and look at it in the terms of dollars.
And I don't mean to cut you off. I think what we're trying to get to tonight is to give the bond council an indication of whether we want them to proceed in exploring all of those subtle nuances, clarifying them, and bringing back together a complete package that gives us the kind of details that you're looking for. But Mr. Serrano, am I off base with that comment?
Mr. Chairman, no, you're not.
Okay, all right, thank you. So, you could have said that from your chair.
And finally, we didn't really get into the specifics of this, but in the document entitled, prepared by Columbia Capital, they talk about, and I want to clarify for the record, specifically, I'm looking at the financial analysis that's part of the package here. At page 19, they talk about the future, at the very bottom of the page, towards the bottom of the page, the future value incentives available to the developer under the plan are approximately $52.9 million. So is that what the city, at the end of the day, at the end of the terms of all these bonds and the CID and the IRB?
So I want to make sure we've got some clarity on that. There was a slide up there a minute ago. The CIDs, the TIFs, is for 19 and a half and nothing more. Everything beyond that is at the risk of the developer.
Okay, my
The
point being.
city is not.
But the benefit to the developer is that number. If I'm understanding this correctly, and if I'm not, I'd like to know that. It says the incentives available to the developer are $52.9 million. I understand fully the city's capped at 19.5, but that's a huge incentive. And I just would like to know if that's an accurate statement.
So that is the estimated future value of all of the TIF and CID revenues over the life of those programs. So 20 years for the TIF and 22 for the CID. So we're taking that revenue stream and we're selling bonds against it. And so the proceeds of those bonds is 19.5 million, hopefully, of what we're targeting, or what the developer is targeting. The rest of those monies are used to pay the debt service on those bonds. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And in light of Mr. Musil's comments of earlier, I'm not going to take this committee's time to address some other matters, but thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Any other comments? All right.
Mr. President, can I just respond to a couple things I think I can clarify?
Sure.
In response to those questions. First of all, will the retail be built with the multifamily? That's important to the city, it's important to the project. Understand that before, and I hate to talk about bonds, think of it as a mortgage. Before we go out and get our mortgage for this project, we're going to have a purchase and sale agreement for the mixed-use development. Executed leases on enough of the retail space so your underwriter that you pick says we can go sell bonds and get as close to 19.5 million as possible. And those leases are going to contain a covenant to open by a certain date. And the reason that Mr. Serrano mentioned that stores like to open twice a year, either in May or in October. We're trying to hit October 2020. That's why this timetable getting done on April 30th, hopefully if we can work everything out, is important. But all that's going to be in place before a bond, anybody ever buys a bond. There are going to be guaranteed maximum price contracts in place for the retail. There are going to be payment and performance bonds, so if this developer just walks away, somebody else has to pick that up and build this. So could something bad happen? Yes. I mean, I could get hit by the proverbial bus walking across the street. But those are all going to be in place before a bond is sold. And any sophisticated investor investing at least $100,000 under the current redevelopment agreement, which we don't fuss about, is going to pay. And your underwriter is going to do that, and the bond investor is going to look at that. So I think there's a comfort level and enough protection that they're going to be built virtually simultaneously. And part of that is because the site work has to be done all at once. We'll work with your council about a separate development agreement or some way to make sure the multifamily developers included, but the site work is going to be reimbursed to the master developer, Belmont Promenade. And that's going to be $10 or $12 million of total site work to level the site, to put in the utilities, to put in the streets. And we're going to give the apartment developer a flat site so they can build on it. So it's not as easy as saying we just need a separate development agreement. Those are going to have to be coordinated. And I understand the reason why you want all the components of this to be built. With respect to the last point by Mr. Lysott, he's right. The maximum benefit to the developer of $19.5 million in 2019, 22 years from now, is $52 million. But the $100 million project value, $99 million project value, is $400 million. The equity put in by the developer of $8 million is now $40 million. And the private lending of $20 million is now $80 million. So just like I think Mr. Calico pointed it out last time we were here, nobody likes to look at their HUD statement when they buy their house and they sign the mortgage document because it tells you what you're going to pay over the 30 years of your mortgage. And if I have a $200,000 mortgage, I'm not paying $200,000 over 30 years. I'm going to pay $450,000 or more depending on the rate. So everything is relative over those 22 years. And that's the way you get a project like this. So I thought those clarifications might be helpful. Thank you very much for your time.
All right. Any other comments from public? We're going to move forward to item number 2, facility improvements through performance contracting. April 23rd, 2018, the City Council directed staff to issue a request for qualifications for performance contract investment grade audit. On July 9th, 2018, the City Council approved a contract with an energy savings company. Assistant City Manager Caitlin Gard will provide an update on the findings. Welcome, Caitlin.
Hi, thank you. We're really excited to present these findings to you tonight. This is a project, like you said, we've been working on for, at least talking about for over a year, and have been working on almost a year. We've been calling this project Sustainable Shawnee. I know that's an initiative that's really important to staff and to the City Council. So we'd like to move forward tonight with some recommendations from our performance contracting company. So if we want to just revisit what the FCIP is, the Kansas Corporation Commission has a program, Facility Conservation Improvement Program to be exact, where organizations can hire a company to review our facilities and our equipment in those facilities, HVACs, all mechanical, plumbing, electrical, et cetera, for potential upgrades that would result in an energy or efficiency savings. So not only are we talking about energy savings as in we're going to reduce our utility rates, but also looking at the equipment, age of equipment, functionality of equipment, just kind of how we're functioning in our facilities as a whole. Our facilities are aging. Many of our facilities are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old. So we need to start looking at those equipment and what do those energy and efficiency savings look like. We then take those savings recommendations and we review them with a third party. In this state, it's Kansas State University. Works with the Kansas Corporation Commission to review those and verify those savings. So any savings that we're going to be recommending tonight are guaranteed through the program. And with those energy savings, we're not only going to pay for the cost of the project, but also the energy efficiency and the equipment systems over the life of the equipment. Not only will we pay for the equipment, but we are also, you'll see, we do get a small return in the long run. So when we talk about the goals of a performance contract, what does that look like? Obviously, we want to ultimately save costs is the ultimate goal, but there's a number of different ways that we can do that. Number one is that energy consulting. We did hire a consultant. We have them here tonight. They're going to be getting up and discussing those recommendations in quite a bit of detail here in a minute. But what does that new efficient equipment look like? Like I said, we have facilities that are very old with equipment that is fortunately or unfortunately original to the buildings, and it is time to take a look at that equipment and what efficiencies we can make and upgrade in those facilities. And then also just the operating plan. What is the operation of those buildings? Are they operating the same as they did 30 years ago? How have we changed efficiently, organizationally, and just what does that need to look like moving forward? Also, this is a huge one, modify the habits and the behaviors of the individuals working in those facilities. A really great example of that is space heaters. I know a lot of organizations have rules and regulations like restricting space heaters. We don't have that here at Shawnee, but it's definitely something that you need to look for, especially moving forward when you're upgrading your equipment and making sure that you're looking at all the efficiencies that you can. And then once you install that new equipment, ongoing commissioning and making sure that that equipment is functioning over the life of the equipment that it's supposed to and continue to operate at that level, and something doesn't mess up or you don't have equipment that's failing early, or what does that look like? And then that ties into our operational savings as well. Just this, how does the systems operate together when you're installing new equipment? Does this HVAC work with this HVAC? Are you competing zones in your buildings? What does that look like? And then additionally, we also looked at our renewable energy sources. And you'll see in your packet memo, we are going to recommend one alternative energy source. And so a combination of all those is going to show you an energy cost savings over the life of the project. So just a summary about where we've been. Again, we've been talking about this for over a year. We issued an RFQ for a performance contracting company. We hired Navitas. They're here tonight. In July, they started that process. The council approved a contract, and we went into a detailed field survey. Got on roofs, got in basements, looked at every single nook and cranny of every building, places that I had not even ever been before. And then we had a preliminary list of what what we think those projects were going to look like in the long run. And since then, through September and October, we really worked on the scope of those projects and just what projects are going to be the most effective and efficient over time. And then what projects we actually want to move forward with. So even though the list we started with was maybe 100 projects long, you're going to see a list of, I think, maybe close to 20 projects tonight that we're recommending to move forward with. And so here we are tonight talking about those projects. Hopefully the committee will recommend to the council to move forward with those projects, and we'll start to get going. So when we talk about those projects, that study was called an investment grade audit. That's a term determined by the Kansas Corporation Commission. So we will talk about the results from that audit tonight. 9 of those projects, which I believe are in blue on the following sheet, which was in your packet, which was also in the document I have sitting in front of you. Same document that's in your packet, just a little bit easier to read. 9 of those projects, so the ones in blue, are immediate facility needs that also happen to provide a positive cash flow over the term of whatever these projects are going to be, which is 15 years. I will say, when you're looking at that list, almost every single one of those projects is going to have to happen eventually, regardless if we do this project or not. HVACs will fail, lights will need to be replaced. Eventually, I don't know when, but we will have to upgrade to LED. So as we're talking about completing these projects, rolling into the scope of a performance contract may seem like the right thing to do if this council wants to move forward. So those blue projects are those immediate facility needs that do provide a very positive cash flow. The rest, the ones in orange, those are 12 additional projects that either have a positive or neutral cash flow that just makes sense including in the scope of this project. And then we also we did include the Green Line, which is kind of a highlight project. It wasn't originally going to be included in this recommendation, but after talking with a few council members, I thought we just felt like it would be a good initiative to have a highlight project that was really public facing. A lot of these projects we could complete with almost nobody ever knowing. HVACs you can't really see. You just can't see these projects. So the one that's highlighted in green is really, if we want to move forward with this initiative, something that is really public facing. And we want to show the residents and the community that this is something that we're really interested in. So all of these projects have accumulative savings. Like I said, this term is a 15-year term, and cumulatively, they will provide a positive cash flow. And if we want to move forward with these projects, it's going to be a 5 to 6 month construction duration, but we're going to start to see those cash savings almost immediately. It'll be this year. So with that, I will invite Ryan Terry from Navitas up. He's going to go through this in with a fine-tooth comb with you guys, and we'll be happy to answer any more questions after that.
Good evening, Ryan Terry. Also with me is Tim Binsman. So my role with Navitas is I'm a business development manager. I kind of oversee kind of the whole program. Tim's over all of our construction and engineering and development group. So we'll, I guess, tag team and kind of answer any questions you guys might have. It's kind of hard to see up there, so that's what we printed this off just to see a little bit better. And I'm going to go over really every line relatively quickly. If you want more detail on each line, feel free to ask, and I can jump into any of the weeds you want to on any piece of scope that we're recommending. But to start, I'll talk through kind of the columns first and what those are, and then get into kind of the rows. So projected energy savings, guaranteed energy savings. Really, the difference there is just a little bit. It's a little bit of risk mitigation for ourselves. We like Caitlin said, the state reviews this. We actually like the state reviewing our numbers to make sure that our engineers are doing a good job, and then they calculate energy savings correctly. So that's projected as what we project, what we believe we can save. Guaranteed is just to put a safety factor on that. O&M savings is operation and maintenance savings. The best example of that is currently you spend about $130,000 a year on replacing streetlights that fail. So with LEDs, they last significantly longer than what is existing. And so much of that cost is just equipment costs, and some outside costs, some inside costs as well. But that it's operational, it's real budgetary numbers to the city by implementing these measures. So almost every line item, about half of the line items have some kind of operational maintenance savings. The fourth column, additional soft economic benefit, in discussion with the city, we wanted to really break out and kind of show two different things. O&M savings is real budgetary, will affect the budget to the city. Soft economic benefit, or soft additional savings, is really an economic benefit to the city. Again, a good example for that is the street lighting. Your internal labor and equipment allocation is $37,000 or $36,000 a year. So there's no plan to lay off any city employees through this project. However, those employees, instead of changing lights, can be redirected to do other activities. So there is some kind of benefit to that. So maybe when you're considering staffing, adding staff, maybe you don't need to add a staff, or maybe those people can be directed to do some deferred maintenance projects that may add that even more value than what that number is. So maybe a little bit harder to quantify, but still, I guess, with the city's administration ourselves, we want to at least acknowledge that there's some kind of additional benefit to a lot of these things. Capital cost avoided, as Caitlin mentioned, that is a number you're going to have to spend a lot of this at some point anyway. Especially, the mechanical isn't going to wait for you to say, well, you can continue to replace a light, really, but mechanical equipment is going to fail. And so it's the economic, or the capital cost avoided is really a conservative number that you would have to spend in today's dollars, knowing that will actually increase as time goes on. So the selected project cost, that's the total cost for the project. Then there's two columns for payback. One is just a simple payback based on the energy savings and operational maintenance savings. Again, does not include the soft economic benefit. So that's the payback number. The last column with capital cost avoided, that's again just to show that this is capital that the city would be spending. I think that the term that I've heard is you'd be forecasting to spend this eventually. Some of it is in the budget now, and it would be forecasted in the next 2 to 5 years, really, that you would spend much of this. So any questions on the columns before I get into kind of scope? Okay. So lighting, that's interior and exterior lighting around buildings, parking lots as well. Going to LED lights. Street lighting is just like it sounds, replacing street lighting. And just as an item of note, that's kind of the critical lead time or critical construction duration. That will take the longest to complete. So that's what that 6 months is based on. Water, that's water fixtures that are old and installed 30 or 40 years ago. There's much more efficient water fixtures that can be replaced and that pay for themselves. Building envelope improvements. This is one of those where we see a lot of people that have space heaters just because a building's drafty, and that's why they have heaters to be comfortable. And so if we can seal up windows, that makes a big difference in the comfort of the space. And and doors and air infiltration in a building. And that makes a positive impact additional to the monetary savings. Building automation, a lot of buildings currently run 24/7, even though they're not occupied 24/7, and that's upgrading control systems. I know Mr. Zimmerman probably knows a lot about control systems, but that's installing and standardizing a control system throughout the city. So city personnel can actually, on their computer over a holiday, make sure that buildings are running the way they should. If there's occupied, certainly needs to be heated and cooled. If not, they should be, temperature should be set back. Engine block heater control, that's, a lot of times city city equipment and bus or vehicles are plugged in when they get in the winter, and this just puts a control on them so they're not drawing electricity at all times. It just puts a timer on it. Rush commissioning, any piece of equipment that we are not going to be replacing, we will look at to make sure it's running optimally. Adding variable frequency drive on pumps. Some pumps run 24/7 or just run in a constant speed, excuse me. This would put a drive on them to run on demand and as needed, and as much the power that they need to run. Performance optimization, Caitlin really kind of talked about that in the little graph. That's really, we often will call it data analytics, and we're taking data of how a building should operate from real-time data of what equipment is running, how the building is occupied, how much energy is being consumed, and optimizing how the building operates. Sealant repairs, that's, Tim, you want to talk a little bit about that, what issues are
Sure.
going there?
So at the Justice Center, at Fire Station 72 and the Civic Center, there are several joint sealants that are failing. And RTI had done some site surveys for y'all a couple of years ago and went and identified what those were and put some budgets in there. So we've carried that. There's also a value at the Justice Center, there are several windows that are leaking. And after our investigation, we believe that there's some failures down at the bottom of the window. So we've got a value in there to go take the window out, correct that workmanship piece at the bottom of the windows, and put those windows back in place.
Just as a point of clarity, by the way, this is great, excellent job. Sealant repairs has a payback on it of 30 years, but there's a whole other piece of that, because if you don't fix seals, there's a building health risk that you get from mold and things like that might be forming in certain areas. Am I off base with a comment like that?
No, not at all. I mean, and it's fair to note too, we're conservative when we go in and make our projected savings in these. And we don't try to go grasp at straws or fabricate what savings could be. I mean, every time that there's a rain that's driving that goes and makes the carpet wet, you guys are sending folks out to go clean the carpets. So, there's things like that are really hard to be able to effectively say, we're going to go put this in there. But it is.
We attempted to quantify some of that.
Yeah, there's a little bit that we put in there, but, at the end of the day, when you've got those failures in the building and you've got sealants that are starting to go and fail and you don't maintain those things, those will add up and end up costing you more money and time and cause more problems. And now you've got leaky drywall soffits as opposed to just some sealant repairs that need to be taking place. So, so it's very similar to maintaining your HVAC equipment and changing filters like you would do in your house. You've got to keep up to speed on it. So.
Replacing water heaters, again, this is just an item that and walking through the facilities that's pointed out of older water heaters, and there's a justification to doing many of them at once, and again, an economy of scale for the old 20-plus-year-old water heaters, rather than replacing them as they go. So the next two are really, you can kind of see the dollar amount wise, pretty large. And we separated those out based on need, really, and imminent need. The higher priority are really the items that in the next year or two are going to need to be addressed. And even in the Civic Center, our equipment is failing now. So really the higher priority stuff that is, some of it is budgeted currently, but you would need to do it very soon. There's, again, several places around the city. And then the lower priority items are items really for your discussion, but they're items that are approaching the end of their life. We've talked about it, and it's, again, to get a little bit of economy of scale as you're mobilizing construction crews. It may be justified to replace items that are 12 to 15 years old, that may fail in the next couple of years and maybe have another 5 years in them. But again, kind of for your consideration to decide whether those lower priority items should be included in the project. And then lastly, as Caitlin mentioned, this is the I guess kind of the fun piece, solar. Solar is, unfortunately, in most places in the country, it economically is tough to justify without rebates. And in Kansas right now, we don't have rebates. So it has an okay payback economically. The city is likely would finance a project like this over 15 years. And so it's really about a break even. But equipment on solar lasts longer than 15 years. Really the piece of equipment that would break is a small piece, an inverter, that would last 15 to 20 years. And then panels should last much longer than that. So the life that you would get out of the solar panel, a longer term view, it is a good economic return. Sure.
So with this particular solar arrangement, I have two questions really. The first is, what % of the electricity needed for the fire station are we proposing be solar?
Good question. So the way you want to size these in Kansas is you don't want to overproduce, because you would sell back to the grid at a much reduced rate, like 2 cents instead of 10 cents is what you buy it. So it's 100?
It's 100 kW. If you go over 100 kilowatts of production, then the net metering value reduces drastically.
So it would not meet the entire need over the year, and really how the utility company works is over 1 month, as long as you're not as long as you are not producing more than you have consumed, that's what you want. You want to produce slightly less than you consume to optimize the financial return. And so it would not totally take it net zero, but it would be, in the least energy producing or consuming month, it would be close. And so that's how it's sized. So we take the load profile of that year over several years and say, here's the lowest consumption in a month, and then we'd size it that way.
Okay, that was question number one. Thank you. Question number two is, it's my understanding that there are going to be new demand taxes essentially in the state of Kansas, where for every solar panel, there is going to be a fee paid to, I guess, KCP&L. Is that a factor in this project, and has that been considered as part of this analysis?
It hasn't. And, it's tough to take all that into account. And the reality is also KCP&L could change rates, and they could change it to a more consumption type or more demand type. And that's all out there too. And so we have taken what you currently have and then escalated it 3.5% a year, which is pretty conservative. Over the last 10 to 15 years, utilities have increased in KCP&L territory about 4.5%. So I've read those things. I've read things where a lot of utilities around the country are changing their rate structures to be more of a demand schedule, demand structure rather than a consumption structure. It's hard to predict those things. That's a fair consideration when considering whether solar is worthwhile to do. Aside from the perception and the good PR that you would get economically, that's a fair question.
It's worth noting, we don't take demand savings into account when we calculate the energy savings. Because if you have a bunch of snow that falls on the day of that month and you're not producing out of the panels, you've just lost, and that happens to be when you peak, you've lost your ability, or it's a cloudy day or whatever. So we calculate consumption savings, but we do not factor in demand savings because of the risk. And we see the profile. So part of our data analytics and our optimization services helps us monitor and see what's going on at other facilities where we've installed it. So we are seeing close to the full value of of reduction and production out of the panel and reduction of what we're pulling out of the meter when conditions are right for us. But
It's not a fair question because I'm asking you to be a prognosticator for a very uncertain regulatory environment. So thank you for muddling through that.
Before, get into other questions we can talk about, I just thought I'd talk about the evaluated but not included lines. The first one's really easy. We're not doing anything at City Hall right now because there may be changes. And we're not quite sure what we're going to do yet. So we took that one out. Currently, you have to haul a ladder out to get up to the roof, and it's kind of difficult to get up there. And so it's a small cost just to be able to access to the roof. At Splash Cove, winterizing the building, we had proposed to turn off or drastically reduce the amount of heat at Splash Cove, but there is some storage there that we need to, that the city is using, so we took that out. Even though it has good payback, there's no room for some equipment that needs to stay warm. Waste oil furnace, so this is something Mr. Zimmerman talked about really from the beginning, that we have put in some places in different municipalities, that's using waste oil from city equipment to heat the Public Works building. Some of the feedback we've received from other clients is they're pretty loud and cumbersome at some point.
Backing up just like Splash Cove and on the pools. And I know one of our pools has heat underneath it for all the units, and if you're going to take the heat out of this, there's also another component there about contraction and cracking if you don't keep certain temperatures on a lot of equipment and a lot of things. Has any of that been taken into account when you're trying to optimize the heat?
Are you talking about?
Is that correct, Neil?
I think on those items, they are not included in this.
They're not included?
They're not included.
Okay.
So we're not doing it.
Right. I want to make sure you're.
Not doing it.
All right.
Okay.
when we did evaluate it, it wasn't going to go, we weren't going to let it go to freezing. We were just going to drastically reduce
Oh,
the
okay,
temperature that
okay.
we were conditioning it at.
All right.
So that is why the waste oil furnace, we did not include that based on some discussions with other municipalities and internally. So we also investigated, and we've seen in some places where a recycle system for water can have a positive economic return. We actually see that more often in places where there's very high water rates, and here in the Midwest, we have reasonable water rates. So it didn't pan out. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to get a picture of the true cost of this, because you're showing a number here, by the time you pay back the bonds, close to $8 million. But when I look at these things here, a lot of these things got to be done anyway. In other words, hot water heaters are going to be replaced, HVAC's going to be replaced. So I'm trying to get my head wrapped around the fact of, let's see, how much are we going to spend anyway, and how much is it going to be the difference between maybe some kind of upgraded system over just replacing it in kind?
That's a good question.
How much we really get, because this number doesn't look that great, when you say, wow, we're only going to save about 1.8 million, we're putting out 7.8 million. I mean, that doesn't look very good, but there's probably another number there that would make this look a lot better.
Yeah, that's maybe something we didn't get into, the specifics of what we're replacing it with. And so in almost every case, we are replacing in kind. So if it's a rooftop unit that is a certain size that is provided, that has these kind of features, it would be replaced with a very similar unit.
You want me to improving the SEER rating and that kind of stuff?
Yes. So newer equipment would have a higher efficiency in it, but we have found that replacing it with, if a standard is 16 or 17 SEER, to go to 21 or 22 is not economically beneficial. And so.
Yeah, I just bought an air conditioner.
It does cost more, but it doesn't.
It was ridiculously more expensive to go to that extra high level.
Right.
It wasn't worth it. But, I was just kind of wondering what was the actual cost here, and you say you're just doing it in kind, so
With some improvements, so we're going to grab control of it. We're going to operate it more efficiently.
I mean, accepting things like solar panels, of course, and hot water heaters. I don't know, you're gonna do those new hot water heaters are on demand instead of the old fashioned gas operator or electrical operator?
They're condensing units, so gas fired, but they're condensing, so from a 95% efficient to what they're probably operating now, probably 75% or so. And I guess when I say replacing in kind, again, the units that we're replacing will have a higher efficiency rating, but I guess I want to stress that a part of our job is to evaluate what I think you're talking about is whether it's worth installing a more efficient piece of equipment, paying a premium for it, and getting more savings, but it costs more. And so our job is to go through with the city and to evaluate what is the best economic return.
Well, and some of these things are going to cost quite a bit more. These LED light bulbs are a lot more expensive than just going and putting an in-kind light bulb back in there, if you could even find one. But yeah, these will last 10, 15 years instead of 2,000 hours or 4,000 hours.
Instead of a year. Yeah.
So, I mean, but I guess I was trying to get to a point where, how much more would it cost us if we just did everything the way it was right now and replaced everything at the current as opposed to what we're talking about doing as far as making these improvements, going for some additional energy reductions and that kind of thing? If there's some way to sift those numbers out, we say, yeah, it's going to cost us like $1.7 million more, but then we're going to save 1.8. Wow, okay, well, we're doing good now. I don't know. Sure, I don't know if I'm
I think
expressing it right or not, but.
Can I jump in? Yeah, I had kind of the same question that Eric had, but if I'm reading it correctly, it looks like for all of these kind of upgrades and sustainability features, not necessarily taking that into account, we're spending basically 7.8, but we're seeing just over 10 million in realized cost savings from OPRO, correct? So we're still coming out positive, yeah.
That's right.
Where are you getting 10? I'm trying to find that.
At the very bottom, total fund.
Bottom chart.
See total funds available.
Yes, so that.
We're not saving $10 million a year.
No, that's the total.
That's across 15 years. That's across 15 years. They get projected savings year by year by year, sums
Right.
to 10,170,000.
So I think your comment is more, we're going to have to spend this capital cost regardless, correct? Therefore,
That's how I interpret it,
therefore,
yeah.
what is the savings now versus over the long term, however long we're going to let this equipment run? What's the difference?
Well, I
That's
think
your
we're just
question?
looking at the 15-year period during which we pay the bonds back. Some of this stuff's going to last more than 15 years.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. But when you comprehensively put it in the package of one project, the average payback is less than 15 years. And so that's why we're utilizing the savings from some of the projects to help pay for those projects that are going to last longer than 15 years. Does that make sense?
And most of the time in our business, why public entities often do the schools, school districts and cities is because, as we've been saying, there's a couple $1 million of work that needs to be done. And so what public entities will do, they'll do all those items in blue that do you really need to replace the lights, LEDs? Maybe not immediately. But if you did all those now, it provides an economic return. And then so it pays for itself quickly and then adds benefit. So when you finance it over 15 years, that excess savings for the blue items will help pay, will pay for the items in kind of the tan. And so, yes, you could do the tan outside of this project, certainly. And you could contract with us and you could select just the items in blue. Cities often, and again, public entities often do it this way so they can package it all together instead of doing it piecemeal, one at a time as it fails.
Right.
And then you have the financing mechanism that it doesn't have a negative impact on the city. Rather than having to pay for it out of capital funds, You're really kind of parlaying energy savings.
Correct. So this is freeing up funds otherwise. That's one piece. The other piece that we've kind of tiptoed around, but it's buried in all of this, when you put all of this stuff into a common bundle, get it all done at once, you've got the economy of scale, which drives the cost of the installation down, as opposed to doing one little job here and there where you're paying mobilization fees over and over again. You get a lower overall cost as a bundled project. That sum up fairly accurately.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
I
And
get that, but I'm also looking at the fact that, I'm still trying to, in my mind, think of ways we could do this on a cash and carry basis. Say do it over a 3-year period and have groupings, these things that group together well. And then we don't have to pay $2 million in interest. Same product within say a 3-year period.
Right, and so that's really what our maintenance schedule, when we talk about the budget, we have a special revenue fund that's just a transfer from the general fund that will ultimately do these projects anyway. Maybe not upgrade all of our LEDs at one time or upgrade our water fixtures, but it would be upgrading all of our HVACs. They're all on a replacement schedule. They're going to fail. We have to budget them at some point. So they are in that 10-year forecast that you see every year. But why not package them together with those projects that we know will have a significant payback and potentially use that payback savings to pay for those more expensive projects rather than paying for it out of the general fund? Rather than paying for it out of the general fund when we can use that general fund money for additional projects.
We're doing a lot of bonding, and it's making me a little more nervous every time we do it, so.
So now we can go over the cash flow, which is kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of numbers here. I think the takeaways are the kind of the ones we pointed out already. The overall economic benefit, budgetary, well, not economic, the overall budgetary benefit over 15 years. So the difference between the 10 million and the debt service payment is roughly $2.3 million over that 15-year term.
Just the last part.
So the $2.3 million is the net economic benefit over 15 years.
To the city. Right. That includes energy savings, that includes.
And operational
costs, operating costs.
and energy savings.
Right.
Benefit over.
And I'm happy to talk about anything else on that too. That's the takeaway.
Yeah, and again, what this doesn't take into account is that soft cost savings. When our public works crews don't have to go out and change 500 light bulbs in our streetlights a year, we can use that labor and equipment towards other higher priority programs or new programs if the council would like to implement, rather than changing incandescent light bulbs.
Right. So what's not in here is the money we save by redirecting our existing resources to get other things done, and possibly in that 15-year period, we've saved ourselves from having to hire somebody.
Correct.
That doesn't show up in here, but it's a soft.
Correct.
And tangible cost.
Go up over the next.
Absolutely.
Their costs will go up.
Yeah.
Potentially, because you never know. Especially when we're talking about these heating and cooling kind of things, and they're using materials like the copper or all these other things that are all over the place.
Right.
Yeah,
Sure,
absolutely.
Like that coin though, over the next few years, there may be technological advancements and improvements as well that we would miss out on. So that's a two-sided coin.
It absolutely is, but also literally as we're standing here talking about this equipment is failing. There have been multiple examples of equipment that is on this list that we've had to Band-Aid until we were going to decide if we're going to move forward with this project, or B, decide we're not going to move forward with this project and cash fund it in a forecast 2-3 years down the road, that we're going to need to continue to Band-Aid. And some of these buildings are 24-hour emergency services buildings or our rental facilities that, A, it doesn't look the best if we have failing equipment in a rental facility, or it's just staff time in those buildings. When you don't have heating in a building that has 30 employees in it gets a little bit uncomfortable. Who wants to work in a building like that?
Plus, the cost to replace something on an emergency basis is always significantly more than if you plan that out.
Even
and open it.
maintenance as well. Calling someone in on a weekend or holiday
Yeah.
gets expensive.
All right.
Any more questions on financing or projects?
Any more questions from council? Comments from the public?
Couple more slides.
All right.
So we do have a timeline. If the governing body would like to move forward with this project, we do need to finalize some things in this investment grade audit report, finalize what our financing would look like. Our finance council has reviewed this and given it a preliminary thumbs up. We just need to finalize all that. Make sure that Ellis and the state are both comfortable with everything that we're setting out, and then finalize the contract, issue a notice to proceed, purchase the equipment, and then, like I said, construction would happen this year, and we'd start to see those immediate savings. With that, we're open for discussion.
All right. Mr. Jenkins.
Just wanted to ask, we buy fire trucks and all that kind of stuff in those consortiums and get the good deals. Is there any kind of deals on these kind of things as well, like HVAC systems and stuff? Do those government
Absolutely.
associations and consortiums
Cooperative
get a break
bidding.
on those as well?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. We would definitely look at purchasing these in cooperative bidding. And then if they weren't available through a cooperative bid, then we would,
Yeah, not
Go.
everything probably would be, but I
Yeah.
mean, just,
yep,
Okay.
and then, absolutely.
Any other questions, comments from council? Yeah. Any comments from the public? All right. Seeing none, I'll accept a motion to proceed as Caitlin has suggested.
Move to proceed?
Second.
I had a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Nay. Unanimous, motion passes. We're making progress. Third item staff will discuss tonight are the train horn quiet zones. Assistant City Manager Caitlin Gard will present information on the city's efforts to implement quiet zones. All yours, Caitlin.
This is my absolute favorite topic
Oh,
to
boy.
discuss. And I ultimately hope that this is the last time that I ever have to bring this topic to you. Thank you, guys. But this is going to be very short. I know a number of the council was not on the council during our many conversations regarding this topic beforehand. So hopefully we can come to a conclusion tonight about how we want to wrap this whole project up and either put it in a budget or not put it in a budget, whatever direction you guys would like to go. But in the city, we have three rail lines that run through the city. One along our southeastern border, one that goes directly down the city, and then one that kind of goes across our northern and western portion of the cities. Also, I'll show you a map here in a second. But the number of trains per day differ depending on what line you're talking about. They're all BNSF-run rail lines as well, so we don't have any UP lines that run through the city, but we have formed a relationship with BNSF through this whole process. So here's a map of the city and those rail lines that I was speaking of. There are two different classifications of a railroad crossing: a public crossing, which occurs at a public at-grade street, or a private crossing, which is a private agreement between a property owner with the railroad to access across the railroad tracks. The city has authority at public crossings to silence those horns in a number of different ways, but the city does not have any authority at private crossings to silence any train horns. The city is not included in any of those agreements, or sometimes not even made aware of those agreements, because they are between two private parties. We do have 5 remaining public crossings after our very long initiative over the last few years. 4 of those of which the train horns still sound. If you do remember, we did silence the train horns down here at 73rd in Martindale. Long story short, it was a private crossing. It is now a public crossing that has lights and gates and signals, and the trains no longer blow their horns. So we have quieted a majority of the Emporia subdivision line that runs down the middle of the city. But the crossings we are going to be talking about today are the 47th, the Lake Crest crossing just north of 47th Street, the crossing at Wilder underneath Holiday, or where it intersects with Holiday. And we will be talking about the Schweitzer crossing in the southeast portion of the city. There is a crossing out at Claire that is a public crossing. Staff has never had a citizen complaint at this crossing, so we did not include it in the study. If at a later time we want to go back and look at it, we would be happy to, of course, but we have never had a complaint. We do get complaints regarding the other 3 crossings.
You've had complaints?
75th?
Not as much, or not as many, I apologize, not as many.
That's all commercial.
It is all commercial. Actually, the complaints we do get are from Lenexa residents.
Oh.
Which,
Tell them to start paying.
The answer to that?
Not worried
yes.
about it.
Yes. But in retrospect, there is a crossing just south of our border on the Emporia subdivision line that our residents hear, but it's in Lenexa, so we hear both sides. But not as many at this crossing. I would say the majority of complaints I receive are regards to the crossing at Lake Crest up here on the north. There is only 7 to 9 trains a day
Yeah,
on
that
that
doesn't seem
line,
much.
and they're mostly not for industrial use. Amtrak also uses that line to get out to western Kansas.
Midnight.
Can I-
and-
sorry.
It's plenty loud if you haven't been out there.
So the one in
Yes.
which there are 7 trains a day, it just seems like quite a bit fewer than the others where there's 89 and 30.
It is
But it's
significantly
one in
fewer.
which we still have a lot of complaints.
It's also the one that's significantly closer to residences.
Yes, it's
Closer to
really
residents.
You
close
can
to
stand
houses.
at a home and
It's
physically
really-
see
I
the
live at
crossing.
48th and it's a nightmare.
Gotcha. So that one is
I would
closed.
throw in there that Amtrak goes through there about 7 in the morning and about midnight.
Yeah, I do believe they
Oh,
have
wow.
a on schedule.
Okay.
So it is, just because there's
Gotcha.
few doesn't mean they're not
I gotta
inconvenient.
leave.
Absolutely.
I couldn't take it, Nolan. I had to go.
So if we want to go over history, we've been working on this for a real long time. This schedule goes way back before anything on this list, but I've been working on it since about January 2015. We took this item to a public meeting because we were being inundated with complaints that have since been resolved, but we wanted to start looking at our crossings and just to see how we can silence those crossings and what we could do. We talked about it with the council a number of times. We did issue a notice of intent to the railroad to establish a quiet zone on that Emporia subdivision line that I was just discussing. And then 2 years later, it did take that long. We finally got a notice of establishment of that quiet zone along that line, which then took a few more months to silence the horns at the 59th Street crossing, 73rd Street crossing, and 75th Street crossing. Some of those were silenced because we actually closed the crossings. We didn't do any improvements. And then many more months later, the trains also stopped blowing their horn at the 55th Street crossing. So almost that whole middle section of the city is silenced, except for that crossing just to the north here off Holiday Wilder.
I believe we've been working on it since, what, 2007?
Oh, hi, Jack. Yes. No, Jack is yes. Kind of how we prioritized the crossings last time was looking at how many trains per day were on those lines and then the number of residential units within 1 mile of those crossings. 1 mile is kind of an arbitrary number. You can absolutely hear the horns further than a mile. So we kind of just used that, we needed a guideline to set a parameter. So what we did is we multiplied the number of trains per day with the number of residential units within 1 mile and came up with kind of this priority rating. And so I did that with the final 3 crossings that we're looking at just to kind of see scope of what we're talking about. So actually that Schweitzer location has by far more residences within a mile. This is not full build out. So the Riverview 1 mile scope will dramatically increase once build out continues in that area, but currently it's not as high. So kind of, and if this is the way the council wants to move forward, this is looking at what kind of priority we want to put these in, if we ever want to put any of these on a capital improvement plan. But as far as a recommendation, we did hire Train Systems to do a kind of a quiet zone study for us just to see what types of improvements that we could do at these crossings. And so they've recommended 2 different types of improvements depending on what crossing it is. There are a number of different things you have to look at in order to recommend a safety measure at a crossing. The city would be required to install these and then ultimately maintain them. The railroad would not pay for any improvements, so the city would be at full cost. But at the Lake Crest and Schweitzer locations, it would be the medians, actually similar to what we installed at 73rd Street. identical, almost identical to what we installed at 73rd Street, medians with 2 gates, and then, which are substantially cheaper than at Wilder, where the only option we have is to install 4-quadrant gates. As you see here, those are extremely expensive. So, unfortunately not. We really are at the mercy of the railroad, unfortunately, with these projects. They are the ones who will bid the work. Any work on their right-of-way is performed by a railroad contractor. I've not seen any leeway that they've given on that, unfortunately. That is, I think, why the prices are so high.
Have we had complaints on Wilder? With the 9
We get complaints from city staff who live close to there, and maybe some council members. But we do have some resident complaints. I would say the most complaints we get are the Lake Crest, by far, the Lake Crest crossing. But I can hear both from my house, and not that it's any bothersome to me, but we do receive complaints on both of those. We really do not receive complaints on Schweitzer, even though it has the highest number of residential units within a mile.
Okay, couple questions. Were you able to check with Miriam to send how much what they put on Johnson Drive, irrespective of the legal ramifications? How expensive was that? Because they've got it at, I don't think they got it at 67th. They might have it at 74th. Anyway, that's mine's a 4-parter, so go ahead.
Absolutely. So what he's referring to is what's called wayside horns. If you've seen, the city of Merriam has installed them on Johnson Drive, just west of 35. My first comment would be that the railroad does not identify those as a safety measure. I forgot to tell you that when we spoke earlier. Therefore, when we do sign an agreement, and actually the language would be any agreement that we sign, regardless if we do medians or 4-quadrant gates, any type of safety system that we install, the railroad is going to require us as a city to sign an agreement that completely indemnifies the railroad of any accidents at the location, regardless of fault. So it is. It is. We actually did sign, when we silenced 73rd Street, we did sign an agreement that included that. Our city attorney and our insurance was comfortable with that because those safety measures have proven effective, whereas wayside horns are a very new technology. I believe Johnson Drive does have gates.
Yeah, it
right?
does have gates.
Okay.
Well, but actually, but Johnson Drive and then right around the corner down where the car places are,
Gates
that
as
one's
well.
got, both of those, all of those have gates along there, but they have the horns.
The same thing with, so the thing about single gates is somebody could easily wind their way through a single gate without a median. That's why the medians make it effective enough for the railroad to approve them as a safety measure. Whereas the wayside horn, regardless of the gate situation, is unknown effectiveness.
Right. Vicki?
One thing that was they also explained to us at one of those meetings that if we put in the silent zone, we pay for everything, we get it all in, and say there's a walking trail along a road right there, even though it's a quiet zone, if they see anybody walking along the side on a road that would run next to a railroad, they are to blow their horns, no matter what.
I believe their exact response would be they have every right to blow their horns at any time they see safely necessary.
Yes.
Would probably be almost exact response from them. So even though we do have a quiet zone along the whole corridor, almost through the whole city, the trains still do blow their horns and relatively frequently. Definitely not 89 times a day, but at least a handful of times. They are. They're still blowing their horns. That's true. At least they're paying attention.
Another question. Okay, I think it would be Overland Park, maybe Lenexa, right down from the Schweitzer crossing. There are 2 crossings there. What did Overland Park or Lenexa do at that crossing, or have they done anything?
I believe they have not done anything yet. I think they are looking at the wayside horns, which we are still reviewing internally, but cannot imagine that the council would accept liability on a third-party company regardless of fault of accident. That is absolutely up to the council, but it would be a conversation we'd have to have later. But I do think they are looking at wayside horns. I believe one of them has medians on it. Without site visiting, I'm not exactly sure, but looking at wayside horns in those locations. Additionally, the Federal Railway Administration has a rule, if there are crossings within a quarter mile of each other, if you are to implement a quiet zone at one of them, you have to implement a quiet zone at both of them. We don't have that issue anymore. We did at the 73rd, 75th location, but we no longer have that issue. But I believe that would apply in that situation.
Yeah, well, that would apply in Merriam, I think.
Yeah. So with that, we just need a discussion. We have costs for safety measure improvements at the 3 locations that we've studied so thus far. It is up, obviously, to council recommendation to move forward with any of these improvements, put them on a capital improvement plan for the future.
Okay, Ms. Meyer.
Yeah, I would just, again, if I wasn't clear enough, advocate for the Lake Crest Crossing being on at least in consideration when we look at the capital improvement plan. I know we have silenced a number of these and helped a lot of folks out, but it doesn't sound like it was 7 horns, but I think those trains all come between midnight and 6 a.m. So it is really just ungodly loud over there. And with the houses that are coming in, I think it's something we should consider looking at.
I heard the railroad scheduled those for when you were at home.
Yes, I think that's right. And asleep.
Yeah, right. Lisa.
To echo Councilmember Meyer's concerns, I can attest to the fact that in that Riverview development, there is actually a property whose back end butts up against ruins for a Monticello trading post. And that kind of demonstrates how close it was to the railroad because that line is still there. So it is very, very close. It continues to build up, and I do agree it needs to be considered on the capital improvement. May I ask one question about our being really excited about indemnification? How does the city's sovereign immunity interplay with that kind of indemnification provision in a contract like that?
It does not, because it's a contract we're incurring a liability by contract. It's a contract, not a tort claim, so to speak.
So we can't.
And what's even more infuriating about it, and most of the council's already heard me complain about this for at least 10 years probably. There's a state statute that says it is against the public policy of the state of Kansas to even ask somebody, much less require somebody, to indemnify them for their own negligence, which is ironic in this case, because even if BNSF contributes to or causes the accident, we have signed a contract with them that says we will indemnify them for any claims resulting from the use of that intersection because of this particular item. And it's really frustrating. So what we had to do, and we were laughing about the fact that the terms are kind of weird earlier, but we have to go to our carrier, and our carrier excludes coverage for the liability of third parties that we incur by contract. And so we have to go to our carrier and get an exception to the exclusion so that we will have coverage for these particular intersections. And that's what we've done in the past. And BNSF is just infuriating about it. And I think this last time, Caitlin became a little more involved in it and had, well, maybe less patience than I did over what they were doing to us. But they won't change. They don't care.
Seems like we could add a contract provision just simply stating, to the extent permitted by law and so as to not waive the city's sovereign immunity.
I included that in the last one, and that's, how long did that take? I mean, it took 3 months, I think, to get 3 words approved.
I just feel like I have to ask the question. That's
They
fine.
finally did agree to allow me to include that language, and then I quickly sent it over to Merriam and said, oh, look, they'll allow this. And so Merriam stuck it in theirs, and Overland Park, they have all hands, not just the upper hand, they have every hand in the whole game. So you have to kind of go by whatever they want you to go by, if that answered your question.
Thank you.
All right. Comment. Okay. Yeah, Mr. Jenkins.
Yeah, we're looking at the 2 medians. At least those are within some sort of reasonability with, with the price. $805,000 is a heck of a lot of money for one railroad crossing. But I can almost see doing the other thing. I just was in my mind thinking about, gee, what if we add those to the street maintenance program and that's a street improvement?
Can we do that by state statute? Add these to the street maintenance program with that sales tax?
Add them to the, I'm sorry.
Street maintenance sales tax revenue can pay for this.
It's right there in the street. It's a median we're building in the street.
There are. Oh, that's true. The highway sales tax. That's true. Yeah.
What was it you guys are talking about? I don't know.
Sorry, there are additional funding sources for the street maintenance program other than just the 3/8 sales tax that
Of
was
course,
approved.
yeah, there's cars and all that
absolutely.
stuff, but
Yeah.
what we do with our own money on our own street improvements should be well within our purview, I would think. And that way we can move forward with that first of next year when we let our new contracts, and bang, it's done. Sidewalks, medians,
For the medians, I believe that probably would apply. I don't know if 4-quadrant gates would apply.
The quadrant gates, I wouldn't even think that would apply. That would.
Yeah,
that's
I
a whole
don't, because
different
they're
ballgame.
outside the scope
But
of
these
our
medians, I'm
street.
sitting here looking at this picture of this median in
Yeah.
the middle of the street. It looks like a street improvement, really. You're just putting a median in there for safety.
Mr. Kimley?
I kind of agreed with Eric when I looked at these. I mean, for what we've paid to silence crossings in the past, the two with the medians are quite a bit cheaper in comparison. With the lake crest, it makes sense because of the proximity to the homes and so forth. I know the Schweitzer one we were kind of joking about, but I'll tell you, in my neighborhood of Tomahawk Hills, you can hear those horns all the way through, all through the night. And so there are people affected. I know we have apartments in that area too that are getting blasted by this. So I think the two that are relatively low in cost in comparison, especially if we consider them street improvements, would be a good ideas to kind of move forward on.
Doug, would you see any issues with that if they were incorporated in the street maintenance program?
No, we just have to obviously offset.
Yeah, it's going to offset something else you would have done, sure, obviously. Right.
For 2019's program or 2020's program?
Well, have you already let those contracts already? I think we have, haven't we? You're bidding them now, aren't you? Yeah, I think it has to be 2020, probably.
I feel, is this a motion that they need to make? Okay. A motion to put these two median projects on the 2020 street improvement program, capital improvement
All right.
project.
All right, so, anybody would like to make a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Unanimous.
With that being said, even though they are on they will be on the 2020 capital improvement program, with my history on how long these projects take, just because the construction will be complete in 2020, it may be a number of years, depending on BNSF's responsiveness and also the Federal Railways Administration's responsiveness before these are silenced. But we will obviously keep you in the loop. Yeah.
All right, any other questions or concerns? Any comments from the public? All right. That concludes our agenda, and before I ask for a motion to adjourn, it was 1 year ago today that I was nominated as president, and tonight is my last night. So, yeah, it's been a pleasure and an honor to work with all of you, so thank you very much. I've enjoyed it, and with that, I will accept a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Motion passes, and we are adjourned. Woo-hoo.